Welcome to Inside Out, mental health at work and in life, where we're exploring why our workplaces feel the way they do and what it takes to build cultures that support genuine well-being. I'm your host, Catherine Eady, and today I'm joined by Dr. Emma Williamson. Welcome to the show. Before we get into the topic of mental health at work and in life, though, for people meeting you for the first time, could you share a little bit about yourself?
Thanks, Catherine. Thanks for having me. So, as you said, I'm Dr. Emma Williamson. I'm a consultant clinical psychologist by background, and I've spent over 20 years in the NHS innovating in healthcare, where I worked at South London and the Maudsley in central London. And my background clinically has been really to try to push the boundaries of healthcare and to help marginalised and excluded populations. So that's where I'm best known in terms of developing clinical services for homeless people, for those with multiple complex needs and multiple disadvantage, and super proud that's now the largest homeless psychology service in Europe, actually. And so we've really been able to demonstrate that by having a trauma-informed approach and helping our workforces think differently across health, social care, the voluntary sector, we can improve practice for people that have traditionally not accessed services. So alongside that, I'm the founder and CEO of Aneemo, which is a health education company. We support organisations, cross-sector organisations, to improve their workforce function through training, through trauma-informed leadership and consultation. We're an e-learning digital platform. We use virtual reality and immersive learning as well, which is really exciting to really throw ourselves into virtual worlds to face things that we don't normally get a chance to practice in the safety of a safe space before we're thrown into those settings on the front line, and training organisations in how to look after their workforce to improve practice. So two different routes I'm coming at the space of thinking about how we are at work.
Yeah, which is very, very interesting because you're working with people who are very far away from the world of work, potentially, who ideally you would like to actually bring into the workforce if they could get the right support. And then, as you say, you've got the kind of workforce stuff you've already been doing. And where does that now technology come into that, which we're very fortunate to have those tools. So I'd love to I'd love to hear your view on this, a kind of broad question, but when you're thinking about a mentally healthier workplace, what does it actually look like in practice? What's your vision of that? What ideally would we like to be seeing?
Well, I definitely think it's a journey, not a destination, that there's always more to be done. But I would see, probably not surprisingly as a psychologist, a healthy workplace as one that's first and foremost prioritises psychological safety, compassion, and a trauma-informed approach. And what do I mean by that? So psychological safety is an environment where people can raise concerns, that workforces can be vulnerable, that they can flag if there are issues for themselves or practice concerns or operational gaps, and to feel safe that they're not going to have repercussions as a result of that they're not going to be humiliated, reprimanded, disciplined, that actually people can raise that they're struggling or that actually we need to do better in a way that feels healthy. But that doesn't mean that we don't have healthy challenge. That does, a psychologically safe space doesn't mean that we don't expect really high standards and we're all striving to improve things, but actually that we can do that in a way that's supportive and compassionate. And psychological safety is actually a key part of being trauma informed, and that's one of my specialist areas, is how I help organisations and services be trauma informed. So just to unpack that kind of buzzword as well, which we do hear around a lot, what do we mean by being trauma informed? Psychological safety and workforce safety and safety for those that use our services, our customers, our service users, is a key part of that. But it also means about how we realise that there's a really high prevalence of trauma throughout the world. 70% of the global population will experience one traumatic situation in their lifetime, and that's not only people that end up accessing services, but we can all be impacted by traumatic experiences that we then realize recognize the impact of that. So what are the signs and symptoms and way that pitches up for our staff, for those that use our services, our customers, the community, in our personal life? So what are those signs and symptoms? Then how are we responding? Not only are we trauma aware, but we are trauma informed. We can do something differently. What do we do to make sure that if the majority of our workforce may be having difficult experiences, and we know mental health distress is a key driver, more than a third of our workforce, sickness and absence can be related to mental health. So how are we doing things differently in our organisation, and how are we avoiding re-traumatising people? So they're kind of the headlines. We're creating safety, we're creating compassion, we have standards, but we do that in a way that gets the best from people. And I think that framework of trauma-informed thinking is relevant whatever sector, service, industry you're in. I think it has huge value for us.
Something that kind of touched on there when you were talking about the 70% is interesting. And I'm wondering, in the workplace in particular, with so many people having different views on what trauma actually is, what it might look like, what the perception of it is, I wonder if there's a population of people who don't think they've experienced trauma that do and have had, and therefore the behaviours that they're displaying, they don't connect the dots to.
Yes.
Because when you said 70%, I'm thinking 100% of people must experience something difficult.
Yes.
But does difficult necessarily equate to trauma?
Yes.
So yeah, it's interesting that you talk about that when we're in the workplace, when we're talking about trauma informed psychological safety. How do we make sure that message is really going to stick with people who maybe don't necessarily recognise it either in themselves or others?
Yeah, that's a great reflection. So I think that there's a subjective element for sure, and that we need to respect people's own definitions and ways they think about their experience and want to talk about it. So some people really won't be comfortable with that term, and they may have been through some really distressing, difficult stuff that someone else would feel very clearly could be defined as trauma. And that's okay to respect terminology, to respect the way that people talk about things. And there's a resilience for some in being able to think about it in a way that has restorative growth, for example, that actually it leads to a reframing and a positive strengths-based view of things. That people's individual approach, I think, is really important that we recognise that. And what I would say is that if we have this trauma-informed lens, it doesn't matter what labels or language or specific experiences people have had, it will benefit everybody and enhance the workplace. And so you may have two people that have experienced exactly the same situation. One may label that as traumatic, or they may have ongoing symptoms as a result of that, and it may have an ongoing lasting impact in their life. Someone else, it may not, and that they may, after a period of distress or processing, be able to regain function. So it also touches on diagnoses and labels, and accessing care and support. So we might think it's very common for people to have post-traumatic stress immediately after a situation, and that's totally normal, and I think normalizing it is really important. But for a group that go on to have prolonged symptoms where it's impacting their daily function across a range of domains, that could then meet a classification of post-traumatic stress disorder. So trauma is a much bigger umbrella, and then within that there are specific diagnoses, and within that specific treatment pathways. But I think that we don't have to label or diagnose people, and that people can have a lot of well-being and social support and watchful waiting. We don't need to jump in necessarily right away, but that doesn't mean that these same principles aren't really valuable whatever our circumstances.
This is being human, and all the different things that come with being human, isn't it? So exactly. So kind of thinking, I mean, kind of that's what we want to see and look like, and you know probably as well as I do, there's still plenty of work to do around that. Absolutely, and it does come with people having different views of well-being in the workplace, and certainly leaders expecting certain people to just get on with things and, pile on more work and workloads and not give people time off for traumatic incidences ultimately. So where do you see organizations getting stuck right now? What you kind of picking up that we've still got quite a bit of work to do?
I think you're touching on a really helpful point there around how we get to the same solution and the outcome, and actually the piling on of pressure. We've got objectives, we've got KPIs, we've got targets, and by focusing on that, I sometimes think there's a false economy and a lost opportunity, because if we really focus on supporting those that work for us the best that we can, those natural outcomes are going to flow from that healthy, happy workforce. And so I think that sometimes being able to step back and reframe that and think, what does good look like? And actually a healthy workforce might lead to these targets and outcomes. I also think that we don't do enough to support our management and leadership teams, actually. I think that sometimes people have stereotypes of what being a leader is about, or they're not given very much training or support or tools. And that I think that this is a real missing area, is those elements on compassionate leadership, on psychological safety, on emotional intelligence recruited when you're looking at leaders, on people that are able to recognise values like trauma-informed frameworks. Because I think that if we can recruit well and support our managers, our middle managers and our leadership teams, then they are going to understand these kind of key principles that lead to better outcomes, rather than just the pressure, like just focusing on the target and not recognizing there's multiple ways to get there.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that in the last few years there have been many articles and discussions on leadership burnout, managerial burnout, even from HR managers and HR leaders, their levels of fatigue and burnout, and they're struggling to manage a workforce who is also struggling. So you've got that kind of knock-on effect all the way down. And I think the other thing that I've picked up on more recently is how many younger people actually have pushed back on becoming managers. So what is that? Has that been a result of what they've experienced in the workplace, what they've witnessed, what they see around them? And I think your definition of leadership, and I think I love the definitions from people like the corporate rebels, where leadership, there's a flattening of organizations, so there's much more of a shared across the board with various people, rather than one person having to oversee 200 people. Well, why does one person need to be responsible for that? Can we not distribute that much more evenly, and help everyone who would like to have some level of leadership skills and be able to use those skills, but not necessarily have that title or role called manager, called leader, that kind of thing. So have you noticed that with younger generations, have you seen that as well, that the kind of hesitancy to be in that position?
Yeah, I definitely think that people's expectation of what they think a leader is and their own experiences, so that really taking out the relational component and it being about driving targets. And I think that sometimes the things that bring people into non-leadership roles aren't the same skill sets and interests that they see being modelled to them in leaders. So if I think about in healthcare, people are drawn into it often because they want to care, they want to help people, they really like that patient-focused work. And I see as a leader that it's exactly the same skills that I'm using when I'm seeing patients as when I'm supporting my clinical team. But actually, I don't know whether that always translates for everybody. And they think, I've got to leave that relational work behind and now become kind of really targets focused. And I like a definition of leadership which is about bringing what's separate connecting what is separate. And I think that that's the element, bringing the different parts together, helping the whole work well. And I think that if we put the relational back into leadership, a lot of this can be addressed, actually.
Yeah. I think there's something in distributed leadership, and it's not one or two people having to hold such high level of just everything that's going on, particularly now in workplaces being as kind of variable and dynamic as they now are. I think distributed leadership is better than ever, where there's lots of people involved in supporting other people rather than one or two people, because you're putting an awful lot of pressure on certain individuals who then they do burn out. They do get exhausted, they do get tired, they get demoralized. Their emotion, their empathy for others starts to decline because they just start becoming frustrated and they lash out. So, we're not, definitely. I mean, again, you're probably the same as me, that you've seen articles saying, we're actually setting up leaders and managers to fail.
Yeah.
I
mean, why would we think that one individual can do everything for everybody? Let's give ourselves a break. Now, I know that I might be really good at something, but hopefully I can develop some insight to recognise that this person's got a developmental need or a specialism that isn't my area, and where would I look to help them get that support? And that there's something about distributed leadership, but there's also something about multiple channels of support and the structures that we put in place. Now, if we're supporting too many people and it's a very steep hierarchy, then those managers and leaders aren't going to be able to give their direct reports as much time as perhaps they need to. So I would say that regular supervision and support is a key thing that we should be giving people, regular one-to-ones, and it's a proactive and preventative intervention. It helps get ahead and address performance as well as well-being issues if we're able to have enough time. But where do we look to peer spaces? Where do we look to different formats and forms of support, and make sure that we're weaving these in throughout the spaces that our teams have? And that's part of letting the omnipotence of leadership slide a little bit, and not thinking you've got to be the one that has to do it all, and being a bit kinder on yourself as well as your teams.
I think that's where we need to go for the younger generation. I think they're going to expect quite a different format of what managers, team leads, managers, whatever that looks like, leadership looks like, which I hope we can work more towards that, because we really are putting off young people from going into this, and it's we're going to have to think a bit differently. So actually, still kind of thinking on leaderships, actually, what pressures or blind spots do you wish leaders paid more attention to?
So I think that we've been touching on some of this already. I do think that alongside emotional intelligence and compassionate awareness for how to get the best from people, I think that sometimes the further up the tree you are, the more that feels distant from the real challenges that frontline teams have. And I do see a real value in always being present on the shop floor, getting out and seeing what's going on, being visible, role modeling, getting your hand stuck in. I think there's a huge value in that, whatever your level is within an organization. But I also think that there's something for me around power and influence. Now, leadership is about power and influence, and how do we use how's there the right use of power? And I think that is ingrained in what we're talking about as well. And I think that, the right use of power for me is about preventing harm, reducing harm, repairing harm, that we're getting the best, we're protecting our organisation, our teams, and that will ultimately lead to the best service outcomes. And I think that sometimes with the best intention, the focus can shift from the internal focus of how we get the best from the team to the outward focus of how we're presented as an organisation, how we're meeting those targets, what's the external reputation. And I think as a leader, you need to be visionary, you need to be forward and outward focusing. But I think that also starts with looking at how we do things in-house.
Yeah, and it's also the pressures that, particularly in the corporate world, the pressures that leaders face from shareholders and external investors, and that can lead someone to kind of think less about people and more about what they need to produce for those people. So, yeah, I think there's something about kind of needing insight. Leaders, do need an incredible amount of insight. They need self-awareness. The emotional intelligence is key. I mean, someone else I had on the podcast was saying there are only 30% of the population have emotional intelligence. Now, if it's as low as that, and we've got lots of accidental managers that just become managers, that makes you think. You think, okay, have we got the right people in the right positions doing the right things for the rest of the workforces and supporting their mental health? Because the other thing that's came about in the last stress results is we've never had such a high level of absence through poor mental health, stress, depression, anxiety. So on the one hand, we're talking about all the things that we need to have in the workplace, but it seems to be going against what we're seeing, which again is, that's a whole nother kind of rabbit hole you can go down, obviously.
On that latter point, just to say, I think that it's important that we think about the wider systemic issues and pressures that people are under, and then how that's showing up in the workplace, the increasing inequality and austerity that people are faced with, and the personal health challenges that are coming up for people, the ageing elements of the workforce, the rise of long-term conditions. I think there's various things that end up coming into the workplace that might not specifically be emanating from work, but could still end up being impacting that space. And so where does employers' responsibilities start and stop? What can they be doing for that wider stuff? And I see lovely interventions around health and well-being and supporting people in their lives more broadly, which is really, really nice. And I also... linking to your first point around emotional intelligence and leaders, I think that even in our conversation, how do we role model compassion throughout? So how are we compassionate for those leaders that are really struggling and trying their best? And I think one thing for leaders can sometimes be they really get the need to support their workforce often, but I think that do they recognize the need to support themselves and start with that, like the rise of burnout and sickness within leaders, or then things becoming slightly hardened within a culture because people are burned out and there's that emotional exhaustion. Actually, who are people turning to in leadership roles? Are they making sure that they're getting their one-to-one spaces, that they are having their annual leave, that they're leaving on time and having boundaries? All the stuff that we know is good for our staff teams. Are we role modeling that? And so that we set a good example for our teams, but also make sure that we're healthy and well and have emotional capacity. I don't know about those stats around emotional intelligence, but I do know that when we're under pressure, our ability to mentalize, understand what's going on for ourselves and others will collapse. And so people may, when they're well and healthy and have mental space, perhaps they're going to be much more emotionally intelligent. They're going to be more available. But we know the signs of the elements of burnout are emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, which is feeling really disconnected from yourself, your feelings and experiences, and lacking in personal accomplishment. So they're Maslach's 3 elements of burnout. And so you're going to not feel that you're doing a good job. You're not going to feel like you've got those wins, and you're not going to be able to empathize and mentalize and support your teams as well, because you've gone offline a bit. You're in that fight and flight mode. So start with ourselves and practice what we preach, I think, is the key, really.
That's really interesting you say that, because so many leaders I've spoken to are not, they're just exhausted. They have got so much on their plate, so much. And they're not being given the space to decompartmentalize. And I mean, certainly many leaders I've spoken to don't have one-to-ones. They don't have their own. Exactly. They don't have that someone to go to. It's like, why not?
Mm-hmm.
So that's still, those challenges exist. So a kind of slightly different question. How has your experience shaped the way you think about mental health at work?
Yeah. So I uh, I think that it's really important to weave the different elements of your experience together, I suppose. So why did I become a clinical psychologist in the first place is always an interesting place to start, isn't it? And we never find our careers by accident, that's for sure. So that people in the caring profession are often drawn because they're caring vicariously for themselves or a loved one, a significant other. And there's mental health in my family. We've had people that have been long-term out of work due to mental distress, and I can really understand the impact of when an environment isn't supportive to individuals, the impact that can have. And so I've grown up around that and recognised kind of what less ideal practice looks like and what people can really need, and that really motivated me. And I think I've also then in leadership roles as a clinical service lead, as a CEO of a company, I'm really recognizing how that plays out for my team, what comes up for them, how can we be compassionate and allow them the space that they need, because I think sometimes giving a little you get a lot back, and actually that loyalty, that commitment shows itself with compassion and understanding. So I think it's shown up in my personal life, which motivated me in my career. It's shown up through my work experience consistently. And then I've had periods of difficulty and distress as well, when there's been difficult things going on outside of work. How do we notice that we've only got so much space? Like, is our cup overflowing? Like, we can't manage stress at work and stress at home, and what needs to give a little? And so it's really taught me a lot around being able to just leave time for self-reflection and know what's in my coping toolkit, really. So I know that I'm a really big drawer of social support. So I have a good network, and I will go to different people for different things, and friends and family, that I am someone that is able to lean on people, is able to share, will to kind of grab people, and that really helps me. But equally, there are times when I really need quiet time. So that's how it's shown up for me when I've been having periods of feeling quite stressed or burned out. And psychology is a lot about talking often, so sometimes I need to come home and just not talk to anyone. So it can be the opposite of that social support. I need to sit on the sofa. Yeah. What's my self-care? Is it a hot bath? Is it watching some really like psychologically informed rubbish on the telly and a takeaway? Yeah. Like, just knowing what are those little bits of micro self-care that we can feed in as well. So I think that's just making sure we're catching it early, because I think perhaps I'm someone who will be quite stoic and just keep going and worrying about other people. So I suppose I was talking about myself with the compassion. How do I have that compassion for myself and practice what I preach? Because I will make sure my team go home, but I might not be good at taking my leave, for example.
Yeah, I mean, that's something we reinforce in our education that we deliver, and we've reinforced it even more, because anyone who's coming kind of into our space, I think they have that compassion, they have that, they want, that kindness, they have that interest in mental health. However, it is often at the expense of themselves.
Yeah.
And there are far too many individuals coming along who I chat to who really providing lots of great support, but my goodness, they're not providing it to themselves. They're not giving themselves a break, they're not taking time out. It's all about other people. And now that we're in the space of such a busy, fast-paced, I mean, I personally can't just the fast-paced nature of the way the world functions is overwhelming for me. But when you talked about, sometimes it's not about other people having a chat with someone else, they actually just want to go away and get space, complete silence. And it's actually more difficult than ever to find silence.
Yes.
So that, that it's really interesting kind of where we are now as well, and what people's needs are. for their mental health.
In the trauma informed leaderships training that we do, we start with a values piece, a reflective exercise, and it's so revealing. It really links to what you were just saying then, because actually we ask people to think about their magical day. If they had their ideal day, what would that be? And then we're able, through exploratory questions, to look at the values that underpin what's important to them. And so often it's about being out in nature, it's about solitude, and often we're doing that with caring professionals or exec teams that are very busy thinking about other people a lot. And actually it's getting out with the dog, it's getting out on the beach, it's in the woods, it's finding some moment of quietness, when often they're giving so much. I think that's really really interesting, actually, is that people do value connection. That's what brings them into the work, but it doesn't mean you don't need a balance.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. And I think there was something a couple of years ago now that really highlighted around noise pollution. And I think it was to do with the level of bird sounds. The birds have had to increase the level of their own bird sounds because the noise of the world and how we function as humans, with so many of us, and obviously transport and everything else, has got louder. And I think the other thing I've noticed a lot more that can impact people's well-being and mental health is I think a lot of us have kind of increased the volume of when we're talking as well, because we're trying to talk through space that is loud. It is chaotic. You think about supermarkets, you think about public transport, you think about travel, you think about just walking down the street in the centre of town. That in itself. So I think it's those spaces of nature, the beach, the dog walks, I think they're actually more important than ever, I kind of get a sense.
And there's a lot of research looking at the well-being benefits of being in nature, having time out, reflection, processing, quiet time, meditation, mindfulness. There's huge bodies of research that link to all of these elements, actually.
So if you could change one thing that would, I know it's difficult, one thing, but one thing can often have a ripple effect. But if you could think of one thing that would improve currently people's daily working lives, what would it be?
Well, I could say being trauma informed, but I feel like that's a cheat because it's a really massive one. So an element of that would definitely be what we touched on around the one-to-one spaces. Good supervision. And I did my doctoral research in attachment in the supervisory relationship, actually. So I was really interested in what leads to good outcomes for psychologists. And just like a therapist and a patient, research shows that it's often it's the quality of the relationship and a secure attachment that actually can lead to the best therapeutic outcomes. And I was really interested, is that modelled in supervision relationships? And so I did some research, and it found that actually a secure, reliable, consistent, available supervisor can lead to the best outcomes, even if those that they're supporting and managing are more insecure or struggling. And so it's really that supervisory relationship that's crucial. And I think that it's about that consistency, frequency, regularity, a space that offers a range of things, a one-to-one space where you can feel seen and heard and processed. At least monthly is essential, I feel, with whatever setting you're working in. And then more frequently if you're more junior, potentially, but it could be a mixture of spaces, or if you're in a particular kind of responsible role, like a clinical role, for example, where you need more governance. But whatever your organisation or sector or setting, that regular supportive spaces that are about you and about your needs, and not only operational elements around your objectives or KPIs, but also have that supportive and restorative element and are supporting your development. They're going to be tackling directly those burnout elements that we were mentioning around Maslow. So they're going to help you with your emotional exhaustion. They're going to help you with depersonalization and compassion fatigue. It will help you kind of reconnect with how you're feeling, and it's going to help you feel more accomplished, because you're going to be thinking, what are my learning needs? Where's my development growth? What training is available for me? What do I need? So I think supervision, not snoopervision, as Karen Treisman talks about it, is really valuable. And I don't mean just for clinical settings. A one-to-one space, as you might call it, in a kind of consumer setting. But then I also think a range of spaces. So it could be spaces, could be the one thing. So peer spaces, are people having a chance to come together? Do you have debriefs after there's distressing critical incidents? A colleague's passed away, there's been a violent episode in your shop, someone, there's been an incident at work, a near miss or something. Are you having those structured, reflective debrief spaces, peer support spaces, team away days, and wellbeing activities? So I think weaving a range of strands that are about spaces for teams would be valuable. But the most important is those kind of one-to-one spaces. And if you're not getting everything you need from that particular person, because we don't always know about the alliance and the relationship, having the courage to be able to think about that with them, and to think about what you need from that space, to raise that and to be continuing to evaluate that, and also be okay to ask for other opportunities as well, like you're getting management, but could I get some specialist support from someone else, or to seek it out informally as well through colleagues, etc.
Does that kind of makes me think, when I think about the people who I speak to who don't necessarily get on with their line manager, their direct report, and it could be, it's all a whole of reasons. It could be just that they're just not aligned with each other. It doesn't need to be anything behind it. What would your suggestion, because this comes up a lot, what can an individual do about that when that is their direct support and their direct person they go to? And I often speak to people who say, there's nothing I can do about that. I don't have the opportunity to request to speak to someone else.
Yeah, that's very very difficult, because we can't always guarantee how someone's feedback is going to be received, if the person's going to be receptive to it, and if it's a psychologically safe environment, to go back to that concept again. I think that that people trying to get alongside the person that they're working with, to think with them clearly about what their preferred style is, what they need from support, what they would be grateful for, and the other person to be able to list what their expectations are, what their needs are. I think that trying to open up conversations and understand things from the other's perspective might help. To try to talk from an I position rather than a you position can sometimes mean that things are less defensive. So rather than you don't do this, you do that, I really appreciate this, or I find this really works for me, might kind of mean that they get a less defensive response. If things have got really difficult and the relationship's beginning to break down, they could look to try and have some mediation, to try and take a colleague in. There may be situations where that relationship isn't functioning and isn't working for either party, and I think sometimes difficult decisions do come to a head. But I often think through restorative justice methods, through proactive raising it, you can often do a lot more. You can think, oh, that person would never be receptive, but actually they sometimes can, if you can phrase things in the right way. Do document everything, obviously. Share your supervision note, take your own supervision notes as well as theirs, and so that you have that paper trail for yourself. But I think trying to get alongside is what I would advise. And when you're starting a relationship, I think often contracting, agreeing what's the expectation, what do we need from one another, what's been like, I always look for cautionary tales, like what have you really valued in supervision before, what examples have you had where it hasn't gone well, and what do you need from me, so that we can kind of notice those themes or spot things if they come up again, of feeling unheard or unsupported. I have a course on Aneemo on supervision skills, actually, because obviously it's my passion area, being having done my doctoral research in that, but in that it's got some downloadable toolkits on how you might structure that first contracting, which I think is really important. And then also how you might manage ethical dilemmas like dual roles. Say your friends outside of work, but then you've got a management, your manager in work. How do you manage dual roles? How do you manage risk situations that come up? How do you manage boundaries, etc.? I think those ethical dilemmas are often we don't give enough time to think about.
Yeah, that's a really good point, actually. Yeah, because I have myself had a manager who was also a friend, and I can see where that can get really, really challenging. Yeah, absolutely. And there's one thing I wanted to pick up before kind of the final question. Do you see a lot of our clients, not well, even before COVID, but much more probably since COVID, are using wellness action plans in one-to-ones? Benefits, pluses, minuses, anything that you think they're useful? You know, is it more about how they're used rather than what they are?
Yeah, I think COVID's definitely brought things more into people's minds. It's a shame, unfortunately, because we'd hope that they're kind of bread and butter throughout. But I think that what's most important is whatever the tools or frameworks we're using are, that they are brought to life and they're a helpful tool rather than a tick box. And I think that's where I would find that when you're just going through things for the motion, going through the motions, they're not going to have as much value as if they're a starting point of a conversation and it opens up things and gets the person reflecting and thinking about it as well. But I think there's definitely sometimes it's the people that might need that most that are the least inclined to want to do it. So I think that's also really useful to spot who are the people that aren't, oh no, I don't need one of those, I'm not that bothered, and actually that they might be the very people that you think would really benefit from that. And so I think that sometimes that consistency of approach can allow you, rather than an opt-in, can allow you to get to people that might be much more hanging on with their fingertips than we realise, and just, you know, look like they're coping.
That's really interesting, actually, because I did have someone say to me just the other day, we use them with some people but not others. And it did get me thinking. It's like, okay, so why yeah, but you know, as you say, potentially the people that might need it the most are not, you know, you're not doing that with, you're using a different way of catching up with people and seeing how they're doing and how their well-being is. But yeah, it's quite interesting how it's been taken or not taken.
I think that's the questions that come to my mind are we at risk of responding once a situation has come up and we've identified it, rather than in a preventative way? Are we at risk of stigmatizing certain groups within the workforce? Is there a sign that it's seen as a vulnerability or a weakness, or kind of a namby-pamby thing that some people that can't cope have, whereas I'm fine? Like, what are the things that we layer on top of the use of tools like that?
That's really good thoughts for people to think about. If for any of you that are using some of these plans, whether they're called wellness action plans or something else, is who are you who's you using with, and is it across the whole teams or organization or not? And so those questions are really good to reflect on for people. So kind of leading to kind of the last thing, really kind of quite broad, what still gives you hope right now? We just had the Milburn report yesterday. We've still got this ongoing challenge with health at work. I'm like you, what you touched on a bit earlier on. I'm like you in that there are lots of factors that impact people able to do their work. We have that aging workforce you mentioned. We have a lot of people living with conditions and trying to work that need flexibility. We have the back to office mandates that doesn't work for people with disabilities who need that hybrid or work from home option. There's so much going on that for people's needs, but there has to be obviously that hope that we can start to get things on the right track. What would your thoughts be to what does give you hope?
Solidarity. Questions like this. Conversations like this, you know, I think that what gives me hope is seeing great people doing great things even in the face of adversity, and I think that I'm continually supported and buoyed up by colleagues from different sectors and spaces, you know, I work within the homelessness space and within multiple disadvantage, and actually rates of homelessness are ever going up. The death of people that are homeless or multiple disadvantaged is going down. You know, the life expectancy is 45 now for a man and 43 for a woman, and it was 48 when I started this work 15, 20 years ago. You know, we're going in the wrong direction in certain areas. Our prisons are overcrowded, there's increasing adversity, and I think that what sustains me is people day in, day out that have compassion and show up and do their best even when it's not perfect. And so that solidarity, and to quote Vicky Reynolds, who's in your kind of team of solidarity that you howl at the moon at when you've had a really bad day, and who kind of bolsters you up and who helps reset you when your boundaries are slipping. You know, I think it's knowing that I've got a great network of wonderful people around me that believe in a better world even when things can feel bleak at times, and I think I have to hold on to that hope because it sustains you really. I
think many of us are that no matter what we see, and of course we're ever bombarded with 24/7 information now that we see. I mean, as a result of yesterday's Milburn report, all of a sudden it was everywhere. So we can end up feeling quite kind of demoralized by that. So the hope is really important, and the solidarity and catching up with peers who are thinking the same in terms of, right, come on, let's keep going with this. Let's keep, you know, fighting for people and what people's needs are, and and all that, and actually also singing the praises of good initiatives. We've got some really good homeless initiatives in Edinburgh.
You have.
That are regularly in the news as well, and it's making sure they're front and center. You know, this is what we can do, this is what we are doing, and this is what we need to do to tackle some of this.
Exactly. And I think, you know, if you're struggling, if you're feeling alone, who's your tribe? Where are your tribe? How can you find them? How can you reach out? Get to those spaces. Bring people around you. That it might not be within your organization, it might be elsewhere, but I think that you can find people that you know, are pulling in the same direction, and that's all we can do. It makes our the load lighter if we're pulling in the same direction.
Well, that's fabulous. It's been such a fascinating discussion. Kind of thank you very much, Dr. Emma Williamson. It's given us a lot to kind of sit with, and to everyone listening, look after yourselves, and we'll see you next time on Inside Out.